The bus groaned under the weight of its passengers, its engine sputtering as it crawled through the gridlocked streets of the city. It was rush hour, and the vehicle was a microcosm of urban life, packed with people from all walks of life, each carrying their own burdens. The air inside was thick with the mingling scents of sweat, stale coffee, and the faint tang of metal. The windows were fogged with condensation, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting a sickly glow over the crowded space. Maya, a pregnant woman in her early 30s, sat near the middle of the bus, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. Her dark skin glistened with a thin layer of sweat, and her eyes, framed by faint shadows, were heavy with exhaustion. She had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the city hospital, where she worked as a nurse. Her feet ached, her back throbbed, and the baby inside her seemed to kick in protest with every bump and jolt of the bus. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise and focus on the thought of her cozy apartment, where her husband, Marcus, would be waiting with dinner. Near the front of the bus stood Jake, a scruffy-looking man in his mid-20s. His jeans were ripped at the knees, his leather jacket scuffed and frayed at the edges. His face bore a permanent scowl, and his bloodshot eyes darted around the bus as if daring someone to challenge him. He leaned against the pole, one hand gripping it tightly while the other fidgeted with a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Jake was the kind of man who thrived on chaos, who felt most alive when he was pushing boundaries. Tonight, he was bored, restless, and looking for trouble. At the back of the bus, Agent Daniel Hayes, a 35-year-old CIA officer, sat quietly reading a well-worn paperback novel, dressed in a gray hoodie and faded jeans. He blended seamlessly into the crowd, his sharp eyes occasionally scanning the passengers out of habit. Daniel was a man who noticed everything. The way the elderly woman in the corner clutched her purse a little too tightly, the nervous glances exchanged between two teenagers, the subtle shift in Jake's posture as his eyes landed on Maya. Daniel's training had taught him to read people, to anticipate their actions before they even knew what they were going to do. But tonight, he was off duty, or so he told himself. He just wanted to get home. The bus lurched to a stop, and a new wave of passengers squeezed in, their bodies pressing against one another in the cramped space. A young mother with a crying toddler, a construction worker still in his dusty boots, a college student with headphones blasting music. Each person carried their own story, their own struggles. But for now, they were all just trying to survive the ride. Maya shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as the baby kicked again. She glanced around the bus, her eyes briefly meeting Jake's. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of hostility, a challenge that made her stomach twist. She looked away quickly, focusing on the window and the blur of city lights outside. She told herself it was nothing, just another long day, just another crowded bus. But Jake had noticed her too. His lips curled into a sneer as he pushed off the pole and took a step closer. "Hey, lady," he called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the hum of conversation. "You think you're too good to stand? Or is that baby of yours just an excuse to take up space?" The bus fell silent, all eyes turning toward Maya. She felt the weight of their stares, the heat rising in her cheeks. She forced a polite smile, her voice calm but firm. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm just trying to get home." Jake laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the bus. "Yeah, sure. People like you always got an excuse. Bet you think you're special. Huh?" Maya's hands tightened around her belly, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. She glanced around, hoping someone would step in, but the other passengers averted their eyes, their silence deafening. Jake wasn't satisfied. He took a step closer, his boots scuffing against the bus floor as his voice rose, sharp and cutting. "You think you can just sit there and ignore me? I'm talking to you." His words echoed through the bus, silencing the low hum of conversation. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Jake and Maya, but no one dared to intervene. Maya's hands tightened around her belly, her knuckles whitening as she tried to steady her breathing. She could feel the baby kicking, as if sensing her distress. "I'm not ignoring you," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I just want to be left alone." Jake's face twisted with anger, his lips curling into a sneer. "Left alone? You think you're better than me? Huh? Sitting there like some queen while the rest of us stand?" He took another step forward, his shadow looming over her. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, charged with tension. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She glanced around the bus, her eyes pleading for help, but the other passengers looked away, their faces a mix of fear and discomfort. A young man in a hoodie shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of it as if he might stand. But he hesitated, his courage faltering. Jake leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour. "You think you're special because you're pregnant? Newsflash. Lady, nobody cares." Before Maya could respond, Jake's hand shot out, his fist connecting with her cheek in a sickening crack. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side, and she cried out, her hands instinctively flying to her face. Pain radiated through her jaw, and her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She slumped in her seat, her body trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. The bus erupted into gasps and murmurs, the sound of shock rippling through the crowd. A woman in the front row clutched her purse tighter, her eyes wide with fear. A man in a business suit turned away, pretending to focus on his phone. The young man in the hoodie looked down at his shoes, his face flushed with shame. No one moved to help. At the back of the bus, Daniel Hayes closed his book with a sharp snap and set it on the seat beside him. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek as he watched the scene unfold. His sharp eyes narrowed, taking in every detail, the way Jake loomed over Maya, the way the other passengers averted their gazes, the way Maya's hands trembled as she tried to shield herself. Daniel had seen enough. He rose to his feet, his movements calm and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. The crowd seemed to part instinctively as he made his way forward, his presence commanding attention even in his casual hoodie and jeans. His mind was already calculating the distance between him and Jake, the angle of approach, the best way to neutralize the threat without causing further harm to the passengers. As he drew closer, he noticed the way Jake's shoulders were tense, his fists clenched, his body language screaming aggression. Daniel's training kicked in, his instincts honed from years of fieldwork. He knew how to handle men like Jake, men who thought they could intimidate others with brute force and loud words. But this wasn't just about stopping a fight. This was about protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. This was about doing what was right, even when no one else would. Daniel's voice cut through the tension, low and steady but carrying an edge of steel. "That's enough. Back off." Jake turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in the man standing before him. "Who the hell are you? This ain't your business." Daniel didn't flinch. He met Jake's gaze head-on, his expression calm but unyielding. "It is now. Walk away, or you'll regret it." The bus fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Passengers held their breath, their eyes darting between the two men. Maya looked up, her tear-streaked face a mix of fear and hope as she watched Daniel step between her and Jake. Jake laughed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think you're tough, old man? Bring it on." Jake lunged at Daniel, his movements fueled by rage and desperation. His fist swung wildly, aiming for Daniel's face. But the agent sidestepped with the ease of a man who had spent years training for moments like this. Jake's momentum carried him forward, and before he could recover, Daniel's hand shot out, grabbing Jake's wrist in a vice-like grip. In one fluid motion, Daniel twisted Jake's arm behind his back, the movement so swift and precise that it left no room for resistance. Jake let out a grunt of pain as Daniel forced him against the bus wall, his face pressed against the cold, grimy surface. The other passengers gasped, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and relief. Jake struggled, his free hand clawing at the air as he tried to break free. But Daniel's grip was unyielding. The agent leaned in close, his voice low and icy, each word cutting through the tension like a knife. "If you touch her again," he said, his tone calm but laced with menace, "this will be the worst day of your life." The bus fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the engine and Jake's labored breathing. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier fear replaced by a cautious sense of admiration for the man who had stepped in when no one else would. Daniel released Jake with a sharp shove, sending him stumbling toward the front of the bus. Jake caught himself on a pole, his face flushed with humiliation and anger. He turned to glare at Daniel, his chest heaving, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. For the first time, he seemed to realize he was outmatched. Daniel didn't wait for Jake to make another move. He turned his attention to Maya, his expression softening as he approached her. She was still seated, one hand pressed to her cheek where Jake had struck her, the other resting protectively on her belly. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle now, a stark contrast to the icy tone he had used with Jake. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his sharp eyes scanning her face for any signs of injury. Maya nodded, though her hands still trembled. I think so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She blinked back tears, her lower lip quivering as she tried to steady herself. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Daniel gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. Just take a deep breath. You're safe now." Around them, the other passengers began to stir, their earlier paralysis giving way to a flurry of activity. A woman in her 50s, wearing a floral scarf, hurried over with a bottle of water. "Here, dear," she said, handing it to Maya. "You must be shaken up. Drink some water." A young man in a hoodie, who had earlier hesitated to intervene, stood up and offered his seat to Daniel. "You should sit down. Man, you just saved the day." Daniel shook his head politely. "I'm fine, but thank you." He turned back to Maya, his voice calm but firm. "Do you need medical attention? I can call for help if you're hurt." Maya shook her head, though her hand still lingered on her cheek. "No, I'm okay. Just a little shaken. But thank you." "Really?" Daniel nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the bus to ensure the situation was under control. Jake was now slumped in a seat near the front, his earlier bravado replaced by a sullen silence. The bus driver, who had been watching the scene unfold in the rearview mirror, finally spoke up. "Next stop. I'm calling the police. This guy's not getting away with this." Daniel gave a curt nod of approval. "Good. He needs to answer for what he did." As the bus rumbled on, the atmosphere began to shift. Passengers who had earlier been too afraid to act now murmured words of encouragement to Maya and praise for Daniel. The sense of collective relief was palpable, but so was the lingering tension, a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. Maya looked up at Daniel, her eyes searching his face. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "You could have just stayed out of it." Daniel met her gaze, his expression serious. "I couldn't. Not when someone needed help." He paused, then added, "Besides, it's what I do." Maya's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. You're not just a regular passenger, are you?" Daniel hesitated, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Let's just say I've had some training." As Daniel helped Maya to her feet, she winced slightly, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. Daniel's grip was firm but gentle, his sharp eyes scanning her for any signs of distress. "Take it easy," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You've been through a lot." Maya nodded, her legs still shaky, but she steadied herself against the back of a seat. As she looked up at him, her eyes narrowed slightly, studying his face more closely. There was something familiar about him, the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his voice, the way his eyes seemed to miss nothing. And then it hit her. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling but filled with realization. "I know you. You're Daniel Hayes. You work with my husband, Agent Marcus Carter." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, his usual composure faltering for just a moment. He took a step back, his gaze searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. "You're Marcus's wife?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and relief. Maya nodded, a small, tearful smile breaking through. Yes. Marcus talks about you all the time. He says you're one of the best agents he's ever worked with. She paused, her voice softening. Thank you for what you did. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. Daniel's expression softened, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It's what we do. Ma'am, Marcus taught me that protecting the innocent is our duty. I'm just glad I was here to help. Maya's smile widened, though her eyes still glistened with tears. You're a good man. Daniel, Marcus was right about you. Before Daniel could respond, the bus lurched to a stop, the doors hissing open. Outside, two police officers stood waiting, their hands resting on their belts as they scanned the scene. Daniel had called them discreetly during the confrontation, his training kicking in even as he dealt with Jake. The officers boarded the bus, their presence immediately commanding attention. One of them, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Daniel. You the one who called this in? She asked, her voice clipped but professional. Daniel nodded, gesturing toward Jake, who was now slumped in a seat near the front, his earlier bravado replaced by a sullen silence. That's him. He assaulted this woman, Daniel said, his tone calm but firm. I've got it all on video if you need evidence. The officer nodded, her eyes flicking to Maya, who was still standing nearby, her hands resting protectively on her belly. Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need medical attention? Maya shook her head, though her voice was still shaky. I'm okay. Just a little shaken, but I'll be fine. The officer gave her a sympathetic nod before turning back to Jake. You, on your feet. Jake glared at her but didn't resist as she and her partner pulled him up and cuffed his hands behind his back. As they led him off the bus, he turned to glare at Daniel, his eyes burning with hatred. This isn't over, he spat, his voice low and venomous. Daniel didn't flinch. He met Jake's gaze head-on, his expression calm but unyielding. It is for you, he said simply. As Jake was led away, the tension on the bus seemed to dissipate. Passengers began to murmur among themselves, some expressing relief, others admiration for Daniel's actions. The bus driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, turned to Daniel. You handled that like a pro. You some kind of cop or something? Daniel shook his head, his tone modest. Just someone who doesn't like bullies. Maya, still standing nearby, gave him a knowing look. He's being modest, she said, her voice stronger now. He's one of the good guys. Daniel glanced at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. I try to be. As Jake was led away by the police, the tension on the bus finally broke. The passengers erupted into applause, their relief and admiration pouring out in a wave of sound. Meanwhile, Daniel had returned to his seat at the back of the bus, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. He picked up his book, a well-worn paperback with a dog-eared cover, and opened it to the page he had been reading. The applause and chatter around him seemed to fade into the background as he focused on the words, his sharp eyes scanning the lines with practiced ease. But the passengers weren't ready to let him off the hook so easily. A man in a business suit, who had earlier avoided eye contact, called out, You're a hero. Man, you saved the day. Daniel looked up briefly, his expression unreadable. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to his book. He wasn't one for praise or attention. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough for him. Maya, however, wasn't ready to let him off the hook either. She stood up from her seat, her legs still a little unsteady, and made her way toward the back of the bus. The other passengers watched her with curiosity, their murmurs fading as she approached Daniel. Excuse me, she said softly, her voice trembling but filled with gratitude. I can't thank you enough. You didn't have to do that. You could have just stayed out of it. Daniel looked up from his book, his sharp eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he seemed to study her, as if weighing his words carefully. Then he shook his head, his voice calm but firm. Yes, I did. People like him thrive when good people do nothing. I couldn't let that happen. Maya's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. You're a good man. Daniel, Marcus was right about you. Daniel's expression softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Marcus is a good man too. He's taught me a lot. Maya nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She wanted to say more, to express just how much his actions had meant to her. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you." Really? Daniel gave her a small nod, his gaze returning to his book. "You're welcome. Now go sit down and rest. You've had a long day." Maya hesitated for a moment, then turned and made her way back to her seat. As she sat down, she glanced over her shoulder one last time, her eyes lingering on Daniel. He was already engrossed in his book again, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. But to Maya, he was more than just a quiet man reading a book. He was a hero, someone who had stepped in when no one else would, someone who had reminded her that there was still good in the world. As the bus rumbled on, the atmosphere began to settle. Passengers returned to their conversations, their phones, or their thoughts. But the sense of collective relief was palpable. The young man in the hoodie offered Maya a shy smile, and the woman with the floral scarf patted her hand reassuringly. For the first time in what felt like hours, Maya allowed herself to relax, her hands resting gently on her belly as she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. At the back of the bus, Daniel turned a page in his book, his sharp eyes scanning the words without really seeing them. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the evening. He had done what he always did, what he had been trained to do. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, he had made a difference in someone's life. And that was enough. A few days after the incident on the bus, Maya and her husband, Marcus Carter, invited Daniel over for dinner. Marcus, a seasoned CIA agent with a reputation for integrity and courage, had insisted on thanking Daniel personally. "You saved my wife," Marcus had said over the phone, his voice thick with emotion. "The least I can do is feed you." Daniel arrived at their modest but cozy apartment, carrying a bottle of wine as a gesture of gratitude. The smell of roasted chicken and herbs greeted him as he stepped inside, and the warm glow of the living room lamps made the space feel inviting. Maya, her face still slightly bruised but her spirits high, greeted him with a hug. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Marcus, a tall man with a commanding presence and a firm handshake, clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Welcome, brother. Make yourself at home." The three of them sat down to a home-cooked meal, the table laden with dishes that spoke of Maya's skill in the kitchen. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, shifting from lighthearted stories about Marcus and Daniel's work to more serious topics. "You know," Marcus said, his tone thoughtful as he set down his fork, "what you did on that bus, it wasn't just about protecting Maya. It was about standing up for what's right. That's not always easy, especially when no one else is willing to step in." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "I've seen what happens when good people do nothing. It's not a world I want to live in." Maya reached across the table, placing her hand on Daniel's. "You reminded me that there are still people out there who care, people who are willing to fight for others, even when it's hard." Daniel looked down at her hand, then back up at her, his sharp eyes softening. "I just did what anyone should do. What you and Marcus have always taught me, that protecting the innocent is our duty." Marcus smiled, a rare warmth in his eyes. "You've always been one of the best, Daniel. But tonight, you reminded me why we do what we do. It's not just about the missions or the assignments. It's about making a difference, even in the small moments." The conversation continued late into the night, the three of them sharing stories, laughter, and moments of quiet reflection. By the time Daniel left, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. As Daniel walked home under the city lights, the cool night air brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint hum of traffic and the distant chatter of pedestrians. The streets were alive with activity, but Daniel's mind was elsewhere. Replaying the evening's conversation, he thought about Marcus's words, about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He thought about Maya's gratitude, the way her eyes had shone with relief and hope. And he thought about the responsibility he carried as a CIA officer, not just to complete missions, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The world was full of injustice. He knew that better than most. But it was also full of people like Marcus and Maya, people who believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. And it was full of moments like the one on the bus, where a single act of courage could change everything. As he turned the corner onto his street, Daniel felt a sense of clarity settle over him. He had spent so much of his life focused on the big picture, the missions, the assignments, the larger-than-life stakes. But tonight, he realized that it was the small moments that truly mattered, the moments where one person chose to stand up for another, where kindness and courage could tip the scales against injustice. He paused at the entrance to his building, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The world was far from perfect, but it was also full of people willing to fight for what's right. And that, he realized, was what truly mattered. With a small smile, Daniel pushed open the door and stepped inside, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He knew the road wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference.